a feminist foreign policy? Since obviously that is not what we live under as we watch militarism grow, white supremacy grow, imperialism grow. So I'm excited today to have my dear friend, Dr. Vashna Jugannath. She is the Deputy General Secretary of the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party and in South Africa, and the Senior Research Associate at the Center for Social Change at the University of Joburg. Vashna is also the director of both Pan-Africa Today and Friends of the Workers, formerly a professor at Rhodes University. Welcome, Vashna.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Jody, for that lovely introduction as well.
Nothing lovely about it. It's only half of what you do. So,
Yeah.
So yeah, let's start with, as women, we want to know who you are. Like you went from being an intellectual and a professor to like really being in the streets and working to create real change in your country. Bring us into your life a little bit.
Well, I think, in South Africa, growing up in South Africa, especially apartheid South Africa, politics is not very far away from your life. It's not like you had the luxury of growing up not being political or having some sort of political engagements with people around you, whether it's your family members, friends, even your teachers in school, they were very political, especially in what we term black schools in South Africa, which refers to African people, colored people, and Indian people. Those were generally people who were considered non-white, which is a term we don't like to use. We call ourselves black. So that's the term we use here in South Africa, which I know is a bit different to other parts of the world in the US. So I think it was never far away in my life, and I grew up very staunchly political, but it was often at that period much more, and I think very correctly for many of us, an anti-racist struggle, given how the apartheid state was structured and its deeply, deeply discriminatory policies on race and very oppressive and violent policies. So, growing up in the 1980s, it was incredibly tumultuous time in our history. Lots of violence, lots of assassinations. We used to often not go to school sometimes for 6-7 months. So when everyone now is going on about COVID and kids not going to school, I'm like, it's a bit okay. We didn't go to school. I think we didn't go to school for half of our high school, and we kind of turned out fine. So can everyone just chill a bit? So it was very difficult time. And I was lucky, though, that by the time I had to get into university as an adult, the apartheid regime had fallen, and having an access to education, having access to university, growing up in a fairly middle class environment, black environment, meant that I could very quickly have access to things that my mother or generations before us did not have access to. And that was very enjoyable for many of us. And we kind of put politics a bit on the backbone. It wasn't at the center of our intellectual life at the time. But that was also very deeply classed, which I was blind to at the time, because we're like, oh, well, we're all fine as middle class people. We were able to transcend some of the racisms. I mean, obviously, there's still systematic racisms, but we were able to transcend and live a much freer life than ever before. However, I think at the same time, the story that I'm telling you is not divorced from the global political stage, because at the time when South Africa became independent in the early 1990s, it was also at the time when the Cold War was ending for the United States, and that meant that the power of the United States was basically, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, had become unparalleled in the world. And as a result, many of the policies that it had used during the Cold War as proxy policies, part of structural adjustment policies within Africa to deal with and gain power over the forces of the Eastern Europe forces and the communist forces, meant that we then developed and took on policies within South Africa that were deeply problematic, that was based on neoliberal structural adjustment programs that were coming out of the IMF and the World Bank, pushed by the United States government. And that meant that very quickly we began to realize that the honeymoon is over, that yes, we have managed to deal with the in law We managed to deal with discrimination, racial discrimination, but that actually we did not have any control over our own economy. And that the economy not only still lay in the hands of the minority, white minority in South Africa, but also lay in the hands of global capital, very importantly. And this has had, over the last 7 years, just absolutely devastating consequences for the South African population. We are the most unequal society on earth. We have the highest, some of the 37% unemployment. For example, under COVID, we lost 3 million jobs. 2 million of those were women, because of privatization and the ways in which, and I know this is also true in the US, the ways in which vulnerable jobs, job insecurity has grown so massively. So by the time I became an academic, it was very clear that the South African state, with these neoliberal policies, had firstly disinvested in a variety of key areas of society: housing, healthcare, education. And this was completely dehumanizing, desocializing the South African population. And we within South Africa were not able to give our own children a decent education. Today, if you want to educate your child, you have to send them to private school. So good quality education became privatized. And that can sometimes cost up to $12,000 a year. And so it's a very unequal, and it's very difficult. So you find this happening over the last 20 years. So by the time I became an academic and dealing with young people who have no access to education, and those that just make it into the system, it's so precarious for them that the minute they might have a bad paper or a bad year, they're out. But also, like kids in the US, I had to now leave universities with incredible high debt that they have to repay off. So there's this problem, and a lot of that began to show around the early 2000s, and it really escalated over the 10-year period. And I think in addition to that, outside the university, there were key ways in which the South African state overtly turned on the African and Black working class. You had in 2013 the Marikana massacre of miners that happened, and it's really brought a light and shone to the world how those exploitative practices have continued unabated. So we kind of, the disillusionment with the ANC and the general politics was very high, but there was no sort of outlet. We couldn't find an outlet for that. And I think one of the things was the student movement sparked something in that, in showing, well, there are alternatives, there's ways you can do this. And so I was very inspired by that, but taking it forward now, much more embedded within an economistic understanding, as well as a class understanding of what South African capital and global capital is really doing. And as a result, in many ways, I was at the time the deputy dean of Rhodes University when this began, some of the protests. And the way in which the universities reacted by bringing military force onto campuses, police and so on, I could no longer be in that role of management within a university that was doing this. So I immediately resigned from that post. And it was in that time that I began to, through my own work, because, in South Africa, the intellectual work, it's so interesting that many people in South Africa, when they want to study Africa, we go to England or the United States to the African studies departments that are there. Everyone who wants to do postgraduate studies goes there, and they don't stay here. We don't have African studies departments here that look at these kinds of things. So it's such skewed education as well. So one of the things I had begun to do was really look at the intellectual history of Africa. Historically, African people and the continent of Africa has been seen as a space that has no intellectual productivity. And that feeds into the racist tropes as African bodies being physical and not cerebral. There's no intellectual work there. So I took it upon myself to develop a course that actually traced that from pre-colonial times, and then looking a lot at African women and the contributions that they have made to intellectual work and so on. And so in doing that, I kind of started working much more closely within the trade union movement, especially the National Union of Metal Workers in South Africa, with teaching and education. And eventually from that was offered to come in to assist, especially with Pan Africa today, in teaching roles, in developing curriculum, and so on, and also working for the Office of the General Secretary. And I have to tell you, Jody, by then, dealing with the way in which the South African academic system had never changed. They have Black people within it for representation purposes. You are highly in demand, but it's the most unwelcoming space. So it was very exciting for me to be able to leave and then be able to work in a way where my work was tied to a political project, and that those things could actually work, and I could see the difference in the immediate. It wasn't something that, you keep on workshopping endlessly, which is what happens in the NGO academic world. So I think that's how it happened, and that's how I ended up, literally on the streets in protest.
Wow. I mean, what a fantastic journey and history lesson. Thank you so much, Vashna.
Okay.
So, I mean, listening to you, I just realized like U.S. foreign policy for South Africa is neoliberalism. And,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about how women in the global South have suffered from that foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. The way in which the neoliberal foreign policy gets imposed onto South Africa, well, sub-Saharan Africa broadly, South Africa as well, but sub-Saharan Africa first, from the 1980s onwards, the early 1980s onwards, is largely through debt, through the use of debt. And the debt, we must remember, doesn't come in magically. It's there through the whole imperial project that preceded it and the colonial project that was there, where these countries were rendered sort of completely bankrupt through expropriation of wealth and resources. And so you end up with countries that are heavily indebted. So America, through its influence, its imperial influence over organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, and we know the United Nations and so on, the ways in which it can enforce certain laws in those global bodies, which are technically supposed to be neutral. And coming out of Chicago, we know these neoliberal policies were harvested there, the ideas come out of there, and it comes through, and it is a way then to control the economies within sub-Saharan Africa without even having a military presence. You don't even need it because you're now just controlling them through resources. And it has been a systematic program of underfunding key areas in our society, areas that make society livable. And one of the key markers of that, for example, is healthcare. People often look at healthcare as a way to measure how happy a society is, how healthy literally a society is. And what you find is that in sub-Saharan Africa since the 1980s till now, there has consistently been a decline in investment in our healthcare. So the GDP every year, it's declined by 1.4%. Whereas if you compare that to countries, for example, in Asia that did not go through the structural adjustment program, such as Malaysia and so on, or China, there the investment in healthcare has actually grown. It's increased massively, sometimes up to 3.7% a year. So this is a huge problem, and the impact it has on women is massive. I was just reading a paper on Lesotho, and most of the women mostly what it led to was the closing down of any state services in terms of women's healthcare. And it's always women's healthcare that suffers the most. And it's so interesting because global medical pharmaceutical companies use the African continent as a site to often test drugs and see the safety of it on African women. And they do so because African women largely use state-run facilities. So they can run these tests on them in exchange for free healthcare or pay very little healthcare. So what has actually happened is over the last 20, 30 years, even that has stopped. Those services, those clinics have all closed down. And you find most recently, for example, Donald Trump, with his cutting of aid to various parts of the world, things like the Marie Stopes Clinic in Lesotho, for example, they've all shut down. So women have no access to healthcare, especially reproductive healthcare. And one of the key things that women are very concerned about is not having more children. So the control of their bodies and the amount of children they can have, because that obviously leads to a variety of different other social problems that they face and how they can live their lives and their independence. So it has a massive impact on that. Secondly, it has an impact in terms of education. We already have a huge problem because large parts of African society, like many other parts of Asia, for example, and the Middle East, there is a very patriarchal view of education and women being in the public space, as we know. So it's South Africa, weirdly enough, does not have that. We've saved from that in a way. So that's one thing. I mean, we have violence on women's bodies, but women are still allowed to be in the open space, in the public space. But what it has led to is that in the main, women's education has fallen massively on the continent because people now would rather educate a boy child over a girl child and so on. So women are now engaging in much more precarious work across the continent. And it has had a massive impact as well on food production and the ways in which global corporations dump food, dump pesticides, dump a variety of things, taking away women's autonomy of producing food. So there's a variety of ways that it's impacted. And also a key area is around violence on women's bodies, the ways in which, the security, the ways in which corruption has seeped into society is directly as a result of actually the state losing accountability to the people. The state has lost its legitimacy in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And as a result, corruption, rampant criminality is something that is often happening in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And as a woman, you're already very marginalized in society. So who do you turn to when there isn't the resources, there isn't a welfare system to take care of you? How do you escape abusive marriage? Or how do you escape, how do you take care of your kids when there's no safety net in society? So I think it has had a deep impact.
Oh my God, that's heartbreaking. I mean, that is a war waged without bombs, which we are seeing constantly. I mean, it's what sanctions are, but it's what neoliberalism is, and that heartbreaking, so sad.
Yeah,
What about the environment, as I think the Mother Earth, since we're talking about the feminine? What about the environment?
I mean, neoliberalism is tied to this open economy, this notion of globalization, the global economy, lack of tariffs, lack of protection around the economy, and that has very interestingly has had the actual effect of much more destruction of the environment and of nature. The idea that government has no business in business is probably like this fundamental mantra that's continuously touted with this neoliberal capitalist mode. And as a result, capitalists have had a free rein in being able to pollute, in being able to, pollute rivers, the air, and so on, rendering vast tracts and vast parts of the world, not just in Africa, but of the world, you cannot harvest it. It's completely unfertile. The land is completely unfertile. It's often very poisonous. Some of the organizations, for example, in South Africa that have sprung up in the last 15, 20 years. For example, there's a shack dwellers movement called Abahlali baseMjondolo, and they come out around people actually living around a dump site, toxic dump site, but being forced to live there because that was where they were getting some work done. But it was just rampant, it was unprotected work. There was no protection for their rights. There's no protection for the environment. For example, in India, what you've had happen is the complete opening up of the Indian market, and that same idea of like business gets to do what it does is those trade-free zones. I mean, they have them all over the world. They have them in Nigeria, they have them in India. In fact, now they're talking of building one here in South Africa. And that basically gives the companies complete access to an area without any accountability to the law of whatever country you are in. And so as a result, in India, parts of Gujarat have been rendered completely unfertile, leading to masses of farming suicides, devastating communities and populations. And I think the people don't actually realize the impact that it has on women as well. If you are unable to take care of your family, one of the key things that capital does is it renders you surplus to the system. And the minute it can do that is when it dispossesses you of your land. And if you have land, it now makes that land unlivable, uninhabitable. So you might still have land, but you are still now surplus because you can't actually use that land. You can't plant, you can't cultivate that land. And as a result, you then have to enter into this labor market that it's increasing in pool size. And you are just more and more vulnerable. And women are severely vulnerable in that system across the world.
Uh, um, so I eventually want to get to some good news, I think. But I still want to go to, I mean, you work closely with a very fantastic labor union. And but what is organizing like for women? You know, in the labor market, do they have the same kind of organizing as men for the mostly jobs that women have?
Okay, I think, in the labor market, okay, so the trade union I work closely with is very male dominated because it's a metal workers union. So traditionally was the case, but we've actually made some great strides in recent years in terms of the inclusion of women into the labor movement, with a lot more female leaders rising within that, especially within NUMSA itself. So that has been really good. It is difficult to have to it's both difficult and easy to mobilize within those sectors. But some of the difficulties lie in the fact that there is this patriarchal view and notion of work and labor and who should be doing what labor and so on. But given that NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, is such a solid organization with such a good structure, it's much easier, in fact, for a woman to become an organizer, to recruit workers, to rise within that organization, because of that structure and because of their commitment from their politics to this. In fact, it's far more difficult for women to actually organize in the areas of labor in South Africa which are women-centric, such as domestic labor. Domestic labor has always been difficult for anyone to organize in any union. And in South Africa, that's a massive area because most black women in South Africa, many black women in South Africa work as domestic labor. So how do you organize there? So the sites where domestic work is happening and where a lot of women are actually involved in labor is sites that are very difficult to organize. So even if you look at, for example, in restaurants, waiting tables, all of that labor is done by women. The cleaning of those spaces is done by women. But we have increasingly seen things like recently there's been a domestic workers union that's been started by Comrade Pinky Mashiana here. And it actually started around a women worker, a domestic worker who basically died while working. So she had no rights, and her family had no rights over her. So this sparked this movement, and they become very actually growing, and they are winning their cases, and they're taking it forward in various courts. So we are beginning to support those alternative sites of labor, because I think one of the things we have to do is we have to redefine and rethink the worker. And the worker is no longer the blue-collared worker on a factory floor, because increasingly the factories are closing down. So we have to rethink how we see work, how we see labor, and then we need to also begin to enter into those spaces and theorize and think through how we're going to actually sort of organize. I mean, I'm sure in the US you'll have, I read things like people have up to 3 jobs. They're all vulnerable jobs. So how do you organize McDonald's workers? How do you do those things outside of that formal stuff? And hopefully we are beginning to do that much more in our trade union movement, in our labor movement as well. There's been a forcing open of that space by people themselves who are on the fringes of what's considered to be official labor and the official worker.
I mean, the vulnerability that you're talking about is giving me chills of just vulnerable life is.
Yes.
Is that allowing an increase of more engagement? Because there's a line when you're super vulnerable, it's really hard to get engaged because you have so little to engage with, and just to survive takes all day. I think that's one of the things here with Ai-jen Poo, who created the Domestic Workers Union, was like they work 12 hours a day, and then they've got to go 2 hours to work and 2 hours from work and take care of kids. Just the capacity to be engaged politically in organizing. And so what she did was take like caregivers, organize people who needed the caregiving, and said, we're gonna, they're not gonna come to work. What do you feel like? And they were like jumped in and said, okay, let me help. Like that was one of the ways she was getting around to, is like, threatening a strike. Couldn't wake people up to what they have, even those people at home. You don't even have to go to their house.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I mean, I know it's
how do you make them feel vulnerable? I mean, I guess I'm seeing the war, what I call the war economy. Could we say we can't end war till we end the war economy, because it's the extractive, destructive, oppressive economy that war serves. And so if you've got the weapons at your back, you can force a lot to happen and create this vulnerability you've been talking about. And I guess the question is, how do we make power, fill that vulnerability? I think they would have less capacity to deal with it.
I think for me, okay, so firstly, it does feel like a weight constantly, right? And you are constantly being attacked on all sides, and how that vulnerability can only be diminished by you coming together, by us coming together and us sticking together, because we begin to form cause. So it's through solidarity that is what we need to begin to do, that we need to begin to stick together. There's this lovely quote by Lenin where he says, it's a long quote, and he's talking about people who make you vulnerable in all sorts of ways. And he says, we're marching in a compact group, and then you're attacking us from all sides, and you're calling us into the marsh, to come into the marsh with you. And actually, we don't want to. And those that want to can go with you all, and they must go, because they'll weaken us and they'll attack us as well. But we need to remain in this compact. How do you create that compact in a world that is so bifurcated, in a world that is continuously being stratified? Well, the world was very stratified at the birth of capital, but that didn't stop trade unions from developing out of capital. And that was done through the solidarity of the workers, who had no other option but to start organizing for themselves. And that is key. We need to start organizing for ourselves. We need to get back to the shop floors. We need to do the hard work. It's not easy, and it's not nice, and it's not fun. It's consistent, hard work that we have to do. And I mean, yes, it's not fun, because we feel defeated at times, but it gives us life. Because we are finally now taking a stand. We are not just like remote automated beings told to clock in, to put our cards, clock out at this time, go to your house, do this. I mean, it's like, one of those depressing Bruce Springsteen songs when he talks about, the factory floor. And we don't want to be that. We want to live in solidarity. We want to have lives, even if it's within this compact. But that compact is what we need to begin to form. And I worry that is the work that we are not doing. And we need to begin to do that. For example, in South Africa, there's always discussions about, the labor movement and then society. But where do the workers go? Are they not part of society? Are they not in communities? They are in communities. They're working for the communities. So there shouldn't be that divide. Even within our feminist movements, like, for example, our comrades in the global north should understand deeply what the imperial powers do, and the ways in which women in the global south are struggling, and what it is that they need as well, not an imposition of ideals and ideas, so that we can come together on the common things. Because patriarchy will use, and capitalism will use whatever technology it needs. And when something gets outmoded, like racism, or notions of patriarchy, it'll say it's fine. They can go. We don't need it. It'll take on whatever the new narratives are. But ultimately, in the end, and it uses different tropes and mechanisms to oppress us in different parts of the world. But the ultimate end is to render us vulnerable. And we need to find strength, and that's how we need to come together. There's no magic answer. If we look at the moments in history when those that are vulnerable across the global south, even within the global north, was in the 1970s and the 1960s. It's no excuse. There's no, I mean, not an excuse, but there's not a coincidence that you had the huge civil rights movements happening at the same time as you had the huge anti-colonial movements happening. There was a relationship between those things of throwing off the shackles of racism. And if we can do it then, we can also do it now. We have much more opportunity now. We have much more tools at our hands to be able to do it. So I think that is what needs to happen. And that's the difficult conversations we need to have, especially now with COVID, when we are told to isolate and be separated. Yes, we do need to be careful and be aware of those things, but that's all the more why we will need to have contact and be together and engaged much more than ever.
Oh, yes. So Vashna, you said like feminists in the global north. What would you like to say to feminists in the global north? That they, ways that you, when do you get frustrated and go, I wish I could say this?
Listen, 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 read, see us actually. See us first. Listen, read, see us. I think that's something that needs to happen. For example, if you think about the ways in which someone like Hillary Clinton can use the rhetoric of war to try and win an election, and women supporting her without any consideration that that war is going to be affecting women in Iraq, in Afghanistan, destroying their lives. Wars that have continued. I mean, America's been in 20 wars and conflicts since the end of the Cold War. It's like shocking to me. And 7 of them are still continuing, unabated. Like the lives of those women won't be the same as a Kamala Harris winning to become vice president, because it's Kamala Harris, whatever her color. Is she going to change that system? Is she going to take on the hawks and the vultures of the United States government, who make war with everyone in the world, who make war through both overt machinery and through the economy? So those have devastating impacts. So they need to take some cognizance of that. There was something I just read now where Jennifer Aniston, this actress in America, she says, I'm voting for the Democrats, whatever, don't vote for Kanye West, that's a joke or something. But she's so proudly wearing this as if it's her feminist action. And I would like to know, what was Joe Biden going to do as his foreign policy? Is he going to end wars that affect women the most, that turn women into migrants, that destroy their homes? I mean, is that what they're going to do? Is Kamala Harris going to do that? No, because if you look at her own history of what she's done to working class and poor women in the United States, it's very scary. So I think that firstly, there needs to be an understanding that feminism is not a label that we wear to be hip and cool and to be with it and in the moment. That it's something we dedicate our lives to, that it's a very real struggle every day for us. It's not something we can wear on our t-shirts or something. It's deep and real. And Jody, you know this. I mean, your whole life has been working towards this. So I think for us, it's just see us, listen, understand that there's a global struggle that we are all implicated in. I mean, the fact that I could go to university on the backs of other women, I have to understand that and I have to come to terms with that fact that I am getting posts because of wars that the battles that were waged against racism for Black people that I myself did not wage, but I can benefit from that. Now, what is my task? Is my task then just to take and not to think about that structure and not to think about my privilege in society? So I think we have to do that deep work. We have to do that analysis. Don't just use the word intersectionality. Think about it deeply and think about your role within that intersectional nexus, and then begin to work out from there. And I think if we all do that, we can come to much more solidarity building and be much more closely aligned with each other.
Wow. I'm so grateful. That is we'll put that on a t-shirt.
Great. Thanks.
Well, Vashna, thank you for sharing yourself with us today and for teaching us so much. I'm so grateful to you and for all you do every day with a smile and your beautiful laugh.
Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you for having me.
The one thing is that you missed to say that I have to say is yes, and to do it all with love for each other and humanity, because that's what shines from you.
Exactly. Absolutely. That should be what moves us.
Yes. I love
Yes.
you. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.